Hey Chloe, I think this will be the last video from quarantine, and I think you're my last kiddo coming out of quarantine. I'm scared to look at my email. I'm afraid that there'll be some more on Monday, but hopefully we're all good. I'm going to teach together a couple of lessons. I'm going to finish up the history of Israel, and then we spent one day talking about the country of Jordan in particular. We had a reading quiz over Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and I cannot remember off the top of my head if you were actually there for that, but it doesn't matter. So I'm going to finish up the history of Israel, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Jordan, and then I'll set all this up on Google Classroom so you can watch the video and watch the PowerPoint. So there will be, excuse me, there will be two videos on, two PowerPoints. One, the rest of the history of Israel, and then the one on Jordan. So I'm sorry that I'm looking at you sideways. I'm going to take a peek at my computer here. So I'm just going to again go through this with you, kind of walk through a little bit of review, and then finish up. I think the last lesson ended with the destruction of Israel, or the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans under General Titus. So on this PowerPoint there will be a timeline that kind of reviews all of that and then picks up where we left off. And so about 2000 BC, Abraham was promised the land of Israel by God and told to go claim it. And so Abraham leaves Mesopotamia and heads west towards what we call Israel today. During that period of time, his family grows to about 70 people. He has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob and Esau. Jacob has 12 sons. One of those is Joseph. Joseph ends up being sent into captivity as a slave by his brothers. And becomes first or second in command in Egypt. There's a famine in the land, and Jacob sends his sons to retrieve food for the family, and they discover that their brother Joseph isn't dead after all, and he's second in command, and they're afraid, but Joseph tells them not to be afraid. What man meant for evil, God meant for good. And he tells his brothers to bring his father Jacob and all of their children and wives and bring them to Egypt, where they will be taken care of. And so the Jewish family comes to Egypt, and over the course of who knows how many hundreds of years, probably 300 years, the Jewish people grow to almost 3 million people, and they threaten the nation of Egypt merely because of the presence of and the number of their size of people. And so eventually God sends Moses back to Egypt to retrieve his people who are crying out for help. Moses convinces Pharaoh, not really, God convinces Pharaoh to let the people go, and Moses takes them into the desert where Pharaoh goes back and tries to retrieve them via force, and of course God swallows the armies of Pharaoh up in the Red Sea. Moses sends 12 spies into the land to decide whether or not they can conquer the land as God had promised, and they're fearful, except for Joshua and Caleb. And are my dogs about to bark? Is that what you're worried about? I hear my husband huffing and puffing. I think my dogs have heard something and they might start barking. Sorry if they do. Anyway, where was I? So I'm sorry, I said 12 spies, I think. The 10 spies, only Joshua and Caleb agree and believe God that he's going to help them conquer the land. And so sadly, the Jewish people, or the Israelites, are forced to live in the desert for 40 years, where everybody 20 and older is going to die in the desert, and everybody under 20 and under are going to go into the promised land. And so so that was from 2000 to 1500 BC, between 1500 BC and 1066, when David makes Jerusalem the capital. The Jewish people conquer the promised land. They conquer the Philistines, the Canaanites. They're ruled by prophets and priests, and eventually Saul is chosen. Saul is very jealous of David. Saul does not obey God, and so Samuel anoints David as the next king of Israel. So he becomes king, I think, in 1060-ish BC. In 1066, David declares that Jerusalem is the capital of the nation of Israel. Jerusalem means city of peace. And then David rules, and then his son Solomon rules for 40 years of peace. Solomon's son isn't a very good king and creates squabbles between himself and the people and some of the other rulers. And so the nation splits into Judah and Israel. The northern kingdom is called Israel. The southern kingdom is called Judah. And the northern kingdom adopts all kinds of pagan idolatry and does exactly what God told them not to. And as a result of that, God removes them from the land, and the diaspora of the Jewish people begins. The Assyrians come in and take the northern kingdom in 721 BC. The southern kingdom of Judah plugs along, but become involved in some of the same problems. And so in 586, Nebuchadnezzar's army from Babylon march on Israel. They surround it, and eventually they destroy it. And they take many, many captives with them back to Babylon. And so that's the beginning of the diaspora of the Jewish people. The next date here is 520 to 430 BC, and essentially picks up a little bit about where Nebuchadnezzar leaves off after the Persians have taken the Babylonian Empire. So about 520 BC, after the Persians have defeated the Babylonians, and Cyrus the Great is installed as the basically the ruler of the known world, he agrees to send the Jewish people back to Israel. And so he actually helps pay for it. Somebody just sent me a text message. He protects them, and so he begins to send contingencies of Jews back to Israel. Zerubbabel and Ezra go back and begin to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah goes back to build a wall to defend the temple from the various tribes around the nation of Israel. And during the same time, Queen Esther is appointed, or she is chosen to be the queen of Persia. I don't know if she was his only queen, but she does, through a series of events, protect the people of the Jewish people, because she obeys God and goes before the king and tells him what's going on. So all of those events happen during that period of time as the exiles begin to return to Israel. And then we have about 400 years, what's referred to as the silent years. There's no prophets in the nation of Israel. It's a really dark time. Malachi is the last book of the Bible. And of course, pretty much all of the prophets, the small little books in the Old Testament, at the end of the Old Testament, are warning the Jews to not repeat the sins that caused them to be exiled in the first place. And there are a few remnants of faithful people in the land, but they continue to struggle. The organized religious leaders become Pharisaical, and so there's these silent years where everybody is waiting to hear a word from God. But he's silent. And then in zero, that we call it zero, but it's the birth of Christ, God speaks really, really loudly. And he sends Jesus to earth and manifests himself as a human being, and then ultimately gives his life in 33 AD at the crucifixion. Following the crucifixion, of course, Jesus is resurrected, and he appears to his disciples. The Bible says to at least 500 more people. And so people see him physically. He spends time teaching them before he ascends back to heaven 40 days after his resurrection. So between 33 AD and 70 AD, the church is a Jewish church. These are people who practice Judaism but now have a faith in Jesus. And we call those the disciples and the apostles, kind of like the fathers of the faith. And they share the gospel. It's during this time that Pentecost means 50, and so Pentecost actually happens 50 days following the crucifixion of Jesus, and it's one of the feasts, the Jewish feasts. It's 50 days after Passover, so that's how we know that it's 50 days from the crucifixion, because Jesus was killed on the weekend of Passover. And so the disciples are gathered in a room. Jesus had promised them before, so 10 days earlier, before he had ascended to heaven, he had promised them that he was going to send them the Holy Spirit, a helper that would guide them and instruct them. And so they're kind of waiting for that. And so during the festival of Pentecost, while people from all around the world are coming, people who practice Judaism, not just Jewish people, but people who practice Judaism are coming from around the world. People from Cappadocia, people from Ethiopia, people from Persia are coming into Jerusalem, and the disciples receive the Holy Spirit. And the Bible describes it as tongues of fire, and they're speaking in all these languages. And Peter gets up and he preaches a sermon, and 5,000 people are saved. And it must have been quite a scene. People thought they were drunk because it was noon and they were speaking in babbling tongues that some could understand and some couldn't. But God spoke the languages of the people that needed to hear it. And so following that event, the disciples disperse outside of Jerusalem. The apostle, Saul, who becomes the Apostle Paul, is visited by Jesus on the road to Emmaus while he's trying to persecute this new Jewish sect of Christians. And then he becomes a Christian, a convert, and he takes the gospel to the known world at the time as well. He goes up to Cyprus, he travels through Turkey and Greece, and eventually he ends up in Rome. And so that's 70 AD. So unfortunately, I don't think in any of Paul's writings that he describes the destruction of Jerusalem. So historians think that he probably was executed prior to that, because surely he would have written about it. And so in 70 AD, the Romans are fed up with the problems in Palestine, except that this time they're calling it Judea. And so General Titus marches down to Israel. He surrounds Jerusalem. He destroys much of the city, and he completely annihilates the temple, just as Jesus had predicted. And it's during this time that the Jewish zealots left. They fled Jerusalem, about 1,000 of them with their wives and children, and fled to the top of Masada. So those events of Masada that we talked about early on in class happened during this time. And I think this is where we ended. There was a discussion about the Arch of Titus. When Titus came back to Rome, he was installed as emperor. He only lived for a couple of years, and his brother who followed him built an arch called the Arch of Titus, which sits in the shadow of the amphitheater of the Colosseum. And inside the arch there is a carving of the destruction of the Jewish temple, the menorah, the stand where the bread is placed, and the trumpets and all of that, which is just a historical narrative of an event that really did happen. And so Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. The next slide, and I think this is where we pick up, hopefully I'm not repeating myself too much and you're bored out of your mind. In 135 AD, the Romans, so this is almost 70 years later, after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jewish people are still giving the Romans quite a bit of trouble. And so because Israel is it's a trade route between Africa and Asia, the Romans were just very, very frustrated by the constant problems with the Jewish people. And so they just decided they're just going to remove all of the Jewish people from the nation of Israel. And so in 135 AD, Romans essentially force all known Jews to leave the area that we call Israel. And they decide to rename the area that was Israel, Palestine, which means Philistine in Hebrew. And it is the name of the Jewish people's ancient enemies, the Philistine. There's a picture there of David holding up Goliath's head after he's killed him with some stones. He's taken Goliath's sword out of his sheath and cut his head off and raised his head up for everybody to see. And so this is kind of the turning point in the name of Israel. It was intentional. The Romans are trying to remove all evidence of Jewish people and even the name of Israel, which is a Jewish name. And so they are trying to just basically rewrite history books and get rid of the thorn in the side. And so from 135 AD, when the Romans did that, until almost 1900, so modern era, the Jewish people are dispersed all around the world. The Bible predicted that this would happen. And so during that, let's see here, 1800 years or so, the most of that period of time, not all of it, but most of that period of time, that area is ruled by Muslim caliphates or Muslim empires. And there was a short period of time that the Catholic Crusades captured Jerusalem. But for most of that time, either the Persians, the Romans, or later the Muslim caliphates take control of that area. There's a map on this slide that shows you the dispersion of the Jewish people around the world. As of 1910, there were about 11 million Jews around the world. There's a large percentage in the United States. It looks like about 4% of the Jewish population is tucked in Eastern Europe, what we would refer to as Eastern Europe today, and a larger 2% of the population of Jewish people looks like are in Russia. And so they're spread out all around the world. There is a little bit still in Israel, North Africa. There's even a small pocket in South America. And so they are literally spread out around the world. Now the Bible did prophesy that they would be brought back to the land. And so as of 1910, that had not happened yet. Now in the late 1800s, as Jewish people were facing persecution all around the world, there was a call by some to come back to Israel, to reestablish Israel as a homeland. We refer to that as Zionism. We've talked about that word before. So Israel is sometimes referred to as Zion. And so proponents of Zionism wanted to encourage everybody to come back to, Jewish people to come back to Israel and to reestablish a Jewish homeland. And so let's see here. The next slide, so after the slide of the map, says 1919 to 1948. So these are kind of two pivotal events. So 1919 marks the end of World War I, and 1948 tentatively is after World War II. And so after World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed because they were on the wrong side of the war. They had aligned themselves with Germany. And so all of that land that had been part of the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim caliphate, fell into the hands of the victors of World War I, which were the Americans, the French, and the British, basically. America didn't want much to do with what was happening over there. And so the British and the French divvied up a bunch of that land. And so Syria, I think Syria and Lebanon became French mandates. Israel and Jordan became British mandates. And if you remember, we talked about Wilson's Arch, which is by the Wailing Wall. There's a picture here of the British Army marching into Israel. And I believe that the gentleman at the front of that procession is actually General, or I guess he was a general, General Wilson, whom that arch is named after. So for about 25 years, about 25, 28 years, 29 years, the British controlled what is now today Israel. I believe they continued to refer to it as Palestine, as to not upset the Muslims and whatnot, but they controlled that area between 1919 and 1948. It was probably still at that point a predominantly Muslim or Arab Muslim country, most of the people that lived there. But after the Holocaust, after World War II, when so many Jewish people had lost everything, they had lost their entire families, their possessions, their homes, their livelihood, and honestly, Europe was a complete disaster. The economies of European countries that fought in the war were just dead. A lot of Jewish people decided, why don't we just go back to Israel and make it our home? We need a homeland. We keep getting persecuted and moved around. Let's go back to our homeland. So literally hundreds of thousands, probably millions of Jewish people from around the world began to emigrate back to Israel. And some of them lived in tent cities. Some of them lived with far-flung relatives that still live there. Things were pretty desperate. And so for several years, Jewish refugees came back to Israel. And over the course of time, they became stronger and stronger and more organized with some good leadership. And in 1948, so 3 years after the end of World War II, they had consolidated around a certain group of leaders, and they had decided that they were going to declare Israel a sovereign nation. The Jewish Council was. And so most of the world didn't want them to do it because they were afraid of the outrage by the Muslim majority population there. Israel was willing to split up Palestine into a Muslim country and a Jewish country. The Arabs rejected that, but Israel went ahead and went forward and declared themselves a sovereign nation in 1948. And then war broke out. All of the Arab nations around Israel attacked the small Jewish contingency that had declared themselves sovereign. Harry Truman, President Harry Truman, very wise man, didn't probably more so than he even recognized, decided to recognize the nation of Israel. In fact, just my understanding is just after the stroke of midnight, as soon as it was announced, Harry Truman declared that the United States would recognize this fledgling new country of Israel. So after 2,000 years of exile and being removed from their home country, Israel becomes a nation again, which is honestly quite shocking. And that they defeated the Arab nations that attacked them is even more shocking. And so they become a sovereign nation in 1948. Okay. The next verse or next slide that you'll see on the screen is a passage from Ezekiel 39. And this is the prophecy that predicted that the Jewish people would come back to the land. My husband is cooking, by the way. He's making some sort of cream casserole dip or something. It smells really good. That's what you hear in the background. But anyway, I'm going to read this verse. When I brought them back from the nations, when I have brought them back from the nations and gathered them from the countries of their enemies, I will show myself holy through them in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God. For though I sent them into exile among the nations, I will gather them to their own land, not leaving any behind. I will no longer hide my face from them, for I will pour out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. So the nation of Israel is back in its land. They are in control of the Temple Mount. Jesus needs to come back. So the Jewish people as a whole have not turned to Jesus, but there are pockets of Messianic Jews that live in Israel today that have accepted Jesus as the Messiah and are believers. So we shall see what time holds. So that was the conclusion of our history of Israel. Whew. All right, I'm going to minimize that window and open up the other one. So, all right, so I feel like I should put like a pause, snap, part 2. Okay, so the next lesson, it says lesson 12 is Jordan. There is a reading quiz over chapter 17, section 4, and I don't know off the top of my head if you've done it yet. So I will check and see. I may waive it if you don't want to have one more thing in addition to everything else. Okay, so there's a map there that shows you the area we're referring to. Jordan is the country that kind of looks like an upside down gun. It's the only one of the 6 Eastern Mediterranean countries that does not border the Mediterranean Sea. It was probably the desert that the Jewish people wandered around after they crossed the Red Sea. If you go to that next slide, it is a picture of the Wadi Rum, which is a desert area in much of Jordan that's got mountains and cliffs, and most of the surface is flat. I kind of wonder if that was maybe underwater at some point, but maybe before the flood, because it looks like with the flat terrain on the bottom and the mountains coming up, it looks like it could have been an ocean at some point. But anyway, that represents sort of the circumstances, the area of what the Jewish people traveling around, wandering in the deserts, pitching tents and worshiping in the tent tabernacle would have looked like. Okay, there's Jordan, there's camel there. I showed this picture to the kids because I wanted them to see the border between Israel and Jordan. So the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee way up north, but actually the Jordan River that goes all the way down to the Dead Sea, and then a couple of other bodies of water, and then desert. And you'll also notice there's something that says the West Bank. That is the area of Israel. It's the West Bank or west side of the Jordan River. That's where a lot of Palestinians live. And let's see here. Yeah, Jerusalem is on the edge of that. So there is an Arab part of Jerusalem. Let me go down a little bit further here. Okay, I'm gonna modify this a little bit. I'll show you some. There are a few pictures in here of the deserts. There are some Bedouin camps in there that you can't really see in that particular picture. There it is. They're tucked against the stone for shade, but there are a lot of Bedouin camps in the Wadi Rum Jordan deserts. Bedouins are Arab-speaking nomads, so in this case, they probably follow their camels and maybe sheep in some areas, but they speak Arabic. There's a picture there that represents or gives you an idea of what it might have looked like when the Jewish people were living in the desert, and it's very similar to what you see in Jordan, the Jordanian desert. There is probably, I would say, the most popular tourist destination in Jordan is a canyon where there's a city carved into the side of the canyon called Petra. And it's considered one of the 7 wonders of the world today. And it's made of kind of a red sandstone, and it is literally a canyon on both sides. And so there's several pictures of it here. If you've seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, they use a building known as the Treasury, which is the first picture of Petra here with the camels in front of it. That is the Temple of Doom. But it's a beautiful city. There's several pictures of it. There's a picture of the monastery, an amphitheater, a minaret it looks like. And then there's some pictures of just the capital city of Amman, Jordan. It's pretty bland. There's, the building materials in Jordan are not beautiful, and so everything's kind of a whitewashed color and square. Of course, it's very hot there. There are a lot of old ancient Greek and Roman ruins around the city. There's a picture there of Amman with a couple of skyscrapers. So there is a more modern part of the city, nice parts of the city, but it's a very old city. The next slide that you'll see is part of a marketplace. You'll see some guitars hanging up there for sale. This is what most of urban Amman, Jordan looks like. To me, it looks like poverty, but it's probably really not. You could probably see a street like this in New York, but it's not dangerous that I'm aware of. It's not necessarily even poor. It's just old in the way they live. You'll notice in a picture of the crowd that some of the women are wearing headdresses covering, some are not. Some are wearing jeans, but they're all dressed modestly, so there's not a dress code for women in this Muslim country. People can dress how they want. The men dress very Western. They've got hoodies on and jean jackets and denim and all kinds of stuff. Let's see here. Because Jordan is along the Dead Sea as well, they take advantage of the tourist attraction, and so there are lots of resorts associated with the Dead Sea and the country of Jordan as well. I have a few pictures of those there. And then I wanted to draw to your attention, there's a map there again. If you look at the very, I guess, southwest corner of the country of Jordan, part of the Red Sea comes up and touches the tip of Jordan, and so there's a resort town there called Aqaba. I think I'm saying that right. Oh, I'm sorry, Al-Aqaba. Yeah, I think that must mean water. And so Aqaba is, of course, the town in Aladdin. So I don't know if there's any association with that or not. But there's a lot of scuba diving there, lots of sailing. It's a beautiful tourist destination for a lot of people. There's a beautiful mosque there. There's a picture of an old tank there where people are scuba diving over it. So there's a lot of military equipment left behind from various wars that have taken place there, and the coral grows on that stuff. So that's when you go scuba diving, that's kind of what you see. The floor of the Red Sea is pretty sandy, and the water is almost not like lukewarm because it's so hot there. So you can scuba dive without a wetsuit, but some people still wear a wetsuit when they dive. King Abdullah, this is one of the definitions. King Abdullah II is the current king of Jordan. I believe he's Western educated. I think he actually got his military degree in the United States. He is the second in a line of monarchs. His father before him was king. Now his father before him actually had 4 wives, which is allowed in Islam, and he is his oldest son from his first wife, I believe. And so it's hereditary. He's a pretty good guy, actually. Gets along with Israel, has a good camaraderie with the West, the United States, Saudi Arabia. He was a fighter pilot when he was in the military. You'll see a picture of him there. He's a little bit older. The picture that I have of him as president, it's probably 10 years ago. But you'll see him in his flight suit, with some pilots that are getting onto an airplane, and I want to describe what's happening there. So he's very respected in Jordan, and I think Western countries really respect him as well. There's a picture there of a young man, Jordanian man, who's a pilot. When ISIS was wreaking havoc in Iraq and Syria, President Trump and France and Canada and others were dropping bombs on ISIS targets in Iraq and Syria. And so Jordan, the country of Jordan, joined the fight as well. It's literally in their backyard. And so they also were dropping bombs. And this poor man here was shot down by ISIS. There's a picture of him captured. He parachuted out of his aircraft. I think it was hit with anti-aircraft artillery. And so members of the ISIS militia have captured him. And so they decided to torture him. Because as an Arab, a fellow Muslim Arab, he was engaged in a war against the caliphate. And so sadly, you'll see a picture of him in an orange jumpsuit walking past a line of masked men who are the members of ISIS. And so kind of the story really quick behind the orange jumpsuit. When the United States was involved in the war on terror against Al-Qaeda after 9/11, any enemy combatants they picked up on the field of battle in Afghanistan or in Iraq, they were transferred to a U.S. military base in Cuba called Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And as long as they were not brought to American shores, the manner in which they are interrogated and questioned can be a little bit more stringent than if they were on American soil. At least that's my understanding. Also, if they come to American soil, there is the thought that they should have access to all of the rights that Americans have access to, such as the right to know what you're being charged with, the right to appear before a judge, the right to a speedy trial, the right to an attorney if you can't afford one. And so the thought of taking all of these enemy combatants from the battlefield and bringing them to the United States and imprisoning them here until they wait for trial was a little more than our government wanted to do. And they wanted to keep them as long as they could to try to get information out of them. In fact, I believe the information that we got on Osama bin Laden to find out where he was hiding was from an enemy combatant picked up. So anyway, at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the inmates wear orange jumpsuits. And so thus, the terror group ISIS, when they would create these propaganda videos where they would capture people who were fighting against them and torture them, they would almost always have them wear orange jumpsuits to represent Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So it's sort of a punch at the United States. And unfortunately for this young man, he was terribly tortured. They created a PR film where he was put in a cage, like an animal cage, and he was drugged. And I never saw the video. I saw some still pictures of it. It was horrible. They doused him with fire or gasoline, and then they lit him on fire. And they recorded the whole thing, and over all the propaganda feed is going on top of his screaming, and just horrible. And so he was killed. So when this video was released to the public, the King of Jordan was beyond furious. And so he decided after several years of not being in the cockpit of a fighter plane, he was going to lead a team of airplanes out over ISIS targets and drop some bombs himself. And so the picture that you saw there of him with his pilots, I believe is the moment that they went off to retaliate against ISIS. So he's a pretty tough dude, needless to say. All right, sad story. All right, there's a few little bullet points about Jordan that you need to know. Again, historically, it became a new country after World War I. It was carved out of the Ottoman Empire. It became a British mandate, and they gained their independence in the 1940s after World War II. And I believe that's when King Abdullah I became king. The Dead Sea and the Jordan River separate Jordan and Israel in the northern part of the country. Petra, which means stone, the ancient city is now considered one of the new 7 wonders of the world. There are more Palestinians that live in Jordan than there are Jordanians, and so that West Bank spills over into Jordan, and so the country of Jordan has absorbed a lot of the refugee problem. There's probably millions of Palestinians that live in Jordan. That's part of the reason international countries have tried to help them. Jordan is not a wealthy country. They don't have access to a lot of the oil reserves that some of the other Middle Eastern countries have. And so the Palestinian refugee problem is a big problem for the country of Jordan. And then the last bullet point is that Jordan is today currently at peace with Israel. They were not historically. They did fight against Israel when Israel announced statehood in 1948. But they have learned to get along, and it profits them economically because they share that border that's very popular with tourists. And they have a common enemy with Israel, and that is the nation of Iran. The Iranians are Shia Muslims, and the people of Jordan are Sunni Muslims, and they are very afraid of Iran. And so Israel has the mightiest military in the area, largely because the United States provides their equipment. And so some of those smaller Arab countries that don't like Iran know intuitively that they're going to have to depend on Israel if it comes down to it. So in spite of the fact that they're Jewish and their religion considers the Jews infidels, they are very afraid of Iran. So we're going to actually talk about that in the next unit. All right, I think that's it. There is one video that I'm going to have you watch. It's actually a YouTuber. She travels to Jordan with a group of women who have a vlog, and she does a really good job, so I want you to see that. So anyway, I think that's it. I'm going to upload everything. If I've forgotten something, I'll try to mention it to you tomorrow. You can finish this whenever you're able to. No rush. I know you have a lot to get caught up on, so hopefully by the end of next week you'll feel normal again. So anyway, bye.